There is a woman standing at a window. She is not watching a parade. She is not celebrating. The city below her is loud with the kind of joy that fills streets and spills over into everything. The kind of joy that makes strangers embrace and children run without being told where to go. Jerusalem is alive in a way it has not been in years. And she is watching from a window. The man at the center of it all is her husband. He is the most powerful king in the region. He has defeated armies that no one thought could be defeated. He has united tribes that spent generations killing each other. He has turned a fortress city into a capital. And today he is bringing into that capital the most sacred object his people have ever known. He is also, at this particular moment, dancing, not the composed movement of a king at a ceremony, not the dignified gesture of a ruler acknowledging his people. He is dancing the way a child dances when no one is watching, uninhibited, unguarded, his royal robes set aside, his crown not the point. He is spinning and leaping in the middle of the street, with the dust rising around him and the crowd roaring and the musicians playing as loud as they can play. And she watches from a window. Her name is Michal. She is the daughter of the king who came before this one. She knew this man before he had a throne, before he had an army, before the whole world knew his name. She once risked her life for him. She once looked out a different window, in a different city, and helped him escape into the night while soldiers were coming to kill him. That was a long time ago. Now she watches him dance, and something moves across her face that the text preserves without explaining. It calls the expression contempt. But contempt is rarely simple in a person who once loved someone. Contempt that deep usually has a history. It usually has a cost that someone paid before it arrived. To understand that look, we have to go back before Jerusalem, back before the crown and the armies and the sacred object being carried through the streets, back to a small town in the hills, back to a field where a boy was watching sheep because no one had thought to call him inside. This is the complete story of David. Chapter 1. The son no one called. Bethlehem is not an important city. In the landscape of ancient Israel, it is a hill town, modest, agricultural, the kind of place people come from rather than the kind of place people go to. It sits in the territory of Judah, south of Jerusalem, which has not yet become Jerusalem in the way we understand it. It is just another city in a contested land. A man named Jesse lives there with his sons. He is a respected man, the kind of man whose family has standing in the community, whose name means something at the gate where elders gather. He has 8 sons. In the ancient world, 8 sons is abundance. 8 sons is a legacy. 8 sons is the kind of family that makes other men nod with something close to envy. On a specific afternoon that will become one of the most consequential afternoons in the history of this people, a very old man named Samuel arrives in Bethlehem. Samuel is not simply a religious figure. He is the last of the judges, the voice through whom the God of Israel has spoken for decades, the man who anointed the first king and then watched that king unravel. He is carrying something heavy, and it is not just the heifer he brings for the sacrifice. He is carrying the knowledge that the king he made is no longer the man God is looking for, and that somewhere in this ordinary hill town, the next one is waiting. He does not know who it is yet. Jesse brings his sons before Samuel. This is an honor. Samuel is not the kind of man who shows up at ordinary houses on ordinary afternoons. When he comes to your town, you bring your best. Jesse brings 7 sons. The first one stands before Samuel, and Samuel looks at him the way Samuel has learned to look at people, not at the surface of things, but at something underneath. The first son is tall, impressive. He looks like what a king is supposed to look like in the imagination of people who have only recently decided they want a king at all. And the text records something that stops a careful reader cold. God says to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." 7 sons. 7 times Samuel looks and says, "No, not this one, not this one, not this one." And then Samuel asks Jesse a question that should not have needed to be asked. "Are all your young men here?" Jesse's answer is one of the most casually devastating sentences in the entire story. "There remains yet the youngest, and there he is, keeping the sheep. Not my youngest son, David. Not I have one more. Let me call him. The youngest, he is out with the sheep." The phrasing of a man who did not think to include this particular son in the category of people worth presenting, not out of cruelty, perhaps out of something more ordinary and in some ways more painful than cruelty, out of assumption, out of the particular blindness that comes from looking at someone every day and deciding without deciding that you already know what they are. Samuel says, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he comes." Someone goes to the field. Someone finds the boy and tells him to come in. And we are not told what David thinks as he walks from the field to the house. We are not told if he is confused, or curious, or if he has learned over the years not to expect much from being called inside. The text only tells us what he looks like when he arrives. Ruddy, beautiful eyes, handsome in appearance, and God says to Samuel, "Arise and anoint him, for this is the one." Samuel takes the horn of oil and anoints David in the midst of his brothers. In the midst of his brothers, the same brothers who were brought forward and found lacking, the same family that did not think to include him. The anointing happens not apart from that family but in the center of it, which means every brother present watches an old man pour oil over the head of the one they left in the field. Then Samuel goes home, and David goes back to his sheep. No announcement. No ceremony beyond the private one. No crowd. No explanation of what just happened, or what it means, or how long it will be before it changes anything about his daily life. Just oil drying on his head in the afternoon sun. And a flock that needs tending. And a future so far from the present that a reasonable person might wonder if it was real at all. This is where David starts. Not with a sling. Not with a giant. Not with an army or a throne or the roar of a crowd, with a field, and the particular silence of someone who has been found by something enormous and must now walk back to ordinary life and wait. The waiting will take years. And what happens to a person in that waiting? What forms in them, and what breaks in them, and what they discover about themselves in the gap between the promise and the fulfillment? That is where the real story begins. Chapter 2. The giant everyone could see. There is a valley in the territory of Judah called Elah. It sits between 2 ridges. And on the day this story takes place, the 2 ridges are occupied by 2 armies that have been staring at each other for 40 days, without anyone being willing to do what armies are supposed to do. On one ridge, the Philistines. On the other, Israel. And in the valley between them, every morning and every evening, a man walks out from the Philistine side and says the same thing. His name is Goliath. He is from Gath. The text gives us his measurements with the precision of someone who wants to make sure you understand that this is not an exaggeration. Over 9 feet tall. Bronze helmet. Coat of mail weighing 125 pounds. Bronze armor on his legs. A javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear like a weaver's beam. The iron point of that spear weighing 15 pounds. And he comes out twice a day and shouts across the valley. "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants." 40 days. The same speech, morning and evening. And the text tells us what happens on the Israelite side every time Goliath finishes speaking. Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, and they were dismayed and greatly afraid. 40 days of dismay. 40 days of fear. 40 days of an army looking at the same giant saying the same thing and no one moving. Now hold that image before we bring David into it. Because the thing that is easy to miss about the valley of Elah is that everyone there has already made a decision. The Philistines have decided Goliath is the advantage they need. Israel has decided Goliath is a problem too large to address. Both sides have looked at the same man and reached the same conclusion. This changes the rules of what is possible here. That conclusion is not unreasonable. That conclusion is the rational response of people who understand military reality. Goliath is real. His size is real. His armor is real. His experience is real. The fear is not weakness. The fear is information. What David brings to the valley is not the absence of that information. He brings a different way of reading it. David arrives at the Israelite camp not as a soldier. He is there because his father sent him with food for his brothers, who are serving in Saul's army. He is an errand boy carrying bread and cheese, told to check on his brothers and bring back some token that they are well. He arrives and the army is drawing up for battle, and he leaves his supplies with the keeper of baggage and runs to the front to find his brothers. And while he is standing there, Goliath comes out and does what Goliath does twice a day. And David hears it. He hears it for the first time. He does not have 40 days of exposure to this speech. He does not have 40 days of watching other men flinch and turn away. He hears it fresh, and his response is immediate and completely unguarded. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? That last phrase is the key to everything. Not who is this giant that we should be afraid of. Not is there a tactical way to address this problem. Not even someone has to do something. The question David asks is a theological one. Who is this man that he thinks he can speak to the army of God like this? David is not processing Goliath as a military problem. He is processing Goliath as an insult. To him, to his people, to the God whose name is being mocked twice a day in a valley in Judah, while everyone on the ridge just watches. His oldest brother Eliab hears David asking these questions and turns on him with the particular anger of someone who has been afraid for a long time and does not want to be reminded of it. Why have you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Eliab sees a younger brother who does not understand the gravity of the situation, who is naive enough to ask questions that veterans stopped asking weeks ago, who has the dangerous confidence of someone who has not yet learned what there is to be afraid of. He is not entirely wrong, but he is not entirely right either, because what Eliab calls presumption, what he calls not understanding, is actually something else. It is the particular clarity of someone who has not yet agreed with the consensus. David has not spent 40 days in the valley. He has not yet been worn down by the daily repetition of the same impossibility. He arrives and sees what everyone else has stopped seeing because they have seen it too many times. He sees a man. A large man. Yes. A dangerous man. Yes. But a man. And a man who is insulting something that matters. Word about David's questions reaches Saul, and Saul sends for him. The conversation between them is worth reading slowly, because it is a conversation between two completely different ways of measuring reality. Saul looks at David and says, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth." And he has been a man of war from his youth. Everything Saul says is factually accurate. David is young. Goliath is experienced. The gap between them by every conventional military measure is enormous. Saul is not being cowardly. He is being rational. David does not argue with the facts. He offers a different framework for reading them. Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion, or a bear, and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. David is not saying he is a great warrior. He is saying he has faced impossible odds before. In private, when no one was watching, with nothing to prove. And he did not lose. Not because of his own strength, because of something else that was present with him in those moments. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul says, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Saul tries to put his own armor on David. The helmet, the coat of mail, the sword, and David cannot walk in it. He has not tested it. He takes it off. He takes instead his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the brook. 5 stones. Not one. Not the one stone that the story is famous for. 5. Because David is courageous but not careless. He is going out to fight, not to perform. He chooses 5 because he might need 5. He takes only 1 as he crosses the valley toward Goliath. The giant looks at him and sees what Eliab saw and what Saul saw. A youth, ruddy, handsome, carrying a stick, and Goliath is offended. "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" He curses David by his gods. He promises to feed his flesh to the birds and the beasts, and David says something back that is one of the most confident speeches in the entire narrative. Not arrogant, confident. There is a difference, and the difference is in the direction the confidence is pointing. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Then David runs toward Goliath. He runs toward him, not walks, not advances with measured military discipline. Runs, the sling in his hand, the stone already being loaded, and he slings it, and it finds the one place on Goliath's body that the armor does not cover, and Goliath falls. The Philistine army sees their champion fall, and they run. Israel and Judah rise with a shout and pursue them all the way to the gates of their own cities. David picks up Goliath's sword and cuts off his head with it. And everything changes. Not because a giant died. Giant die. Battles are won and lost. What changes is what the people standing on the ridge saw happen in the valley. They watched someone walk into the space that fear had created and refused to inhabit it the way fear required. They saw a boy with a sling do what an army with swords could not. And now they know his name, which is its own kind of danger. Because before this morning, David was the boy left in the field, the one not called inside, the one the family did not think to present. After this afternoon, he is the young man who killed Goliath. And the people who need heroes have very little patience for the complexity of the people they turn into them. Chapter 3. The King Who Heard the Song. Saul loved David after the Valley of Elah. That is the first thing to understand about what came next, because it is the thing that makes what came after so much harder to dismiss as simple villainy. Saul did not start as David's enemy. He started as David's protector. He brought David into his household. He gave him a position. He made him a commander over men of war. He kept him close in the way that powerful people keep close, the people who have done something that impressed them deeply and whom they want near because something about their presence feels like an advantage. David pleased him. The text says it plainly. And everyone who saw David was pleased with him too. That is a remarkable thing to record about a person. Not that he was talented, not that he was capable, that everyone who encountered him was pleased. There was something in David that drew people toward him, the way certain kinds of light draw everything in a room toward one point. Saul's own son Jonathan met David that day after the battle, and the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. Saul's servants liked him. The people liked him. The women who danced in celebration when the army returned sang songs about him. This is where the problem began. The women sang as they celebrated. They sang, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. It is a song, a couplet, the kind of thing that gets chanted in a crowd because it has rhythm and it rhymes and it captures something that feels true in the moment of celebration. The women are not making a careful political statement. They are not trying to wound Saul. They are singing because armies came home and the enemy ran and there is music in the streets. But Saul heard the song, and the text tells us exactly what happened inside him when he heard it. Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" That last sentence. What more can he have but the kingdom? Saul did not mishear the song. He heard it very clearly. He heard in it a comparison that the women singing probably did not intend as a threat. He heard in it the sound of a crowd measuring two men against each other and finding one of them larger. And in that measuring, he heard something that went deeper than pride. He heard the future. Now we need to stop here and resist the temptation to make Saul simple. He is one of the most important characters in the entire story of David, and the way we read him shapes the way we read everything that comes after. It is easy to read Saul as a villain. It is more honest to read him as a warning. Saul was chosen. He was anointed by the same Samuel who would later anoint David. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel, which in the ancient world was not merely a physical description but a statement about destiny. He was the first king, the one the people asked for when they decided they wanted to be like other nations and have a king to lead them and fight their battles. And Saul had been faithful. Imperfectly. Yes, he had made mistakes. He had done things that cost him the endorsement of Samuel and the favor he once had. But he had also fought wars and held the kingdom together and ruled for years before David ever appeared in his life. And now here was David, young, gifted, beloved by everyone, killing giants while Saul watched from the ridge, moving through the world with the ease of someone who has not yet learned that the world can be taken from you, gathering admiration the way certain people gather it without seeming to try, which is often the most maddening kind. The evil spirit that the text says came upon Saul after the song, the darkness that would seize him at intervals and make him dangerous. It did not begin in cruelty. It began in fear. The particular fear of a person who has built something and loves it and can feel it beginning to slip and does not know how to hold on without becoming someone he does not want to be. What do you do when you feel your life being taken from you by someone who is not even trying to take it? Saul tried to pin David to the wall with a spear. Twice. Both times David escaped. Saul tried to send him on military campaigns that would get him killed. The Philistines would do what Saul could not do directly. But David succeeded in everything Saul sent him to do, and came back from each mission with more reputation than he left with. Saul tried to use his own daughters. He offered his older daughter Merab to David in marriage, with the private calculation that the Philistines would eventually kill a man as active in battle as David was becoming. But that arrangement fell apart. Then his younger daughter Michal loved David. And when Saul heard about it, he was pleased, not because he wanted his daughter to be happy, because now he had a different kind of trap. He sent word to David, "Become my son-in-law." The bride price he set was not gold or cattle. It was 100 Philistine foreskins. The mission he was designing was supposed to kill the man he could not kill himself. David brought back 200. Every scheme Saul devised to destroy David made David more visible, more celebrated, more obviously protected by something that Saul's own plans could not touch. And this is the part of Saul's story that deserves real attention, because it contains something true about how fear operates in a person given power. Saul did not simply become jealous of David's popularity and decide to eliminate a rival. What happened to Saul was slower and more corrosive than that. He looked at David and saw someone who reminded him of what he himself had once been. Or perhaps what he had always wanted to be. Someone who moved in the world without the grinding anxiety that had become Saul's constant companion. Someone whose relationship with God seemed untroubled by the accumulation of mistakes and corrections and the weight of years of difficult decisions. And instead of letting that be what it was, instead of finding a way to hold his own story alongside this new one without requiring one of them to disappear, Saul chose something else. He chose to see David as the problem. Once you make that choice, every good thing about the person you fear becomes evidence against them. Every victory they win looks like a theft. Every person who loves them is a person you are losing. The logic of the threatened person is relentless and self-reinforcing, and it leads always to the same place. Saul began to see enemies everywhere. He turned on his own servants. He accused them of conspiring against him. He turned on his son Jonathan, who was openly loyal to David, and threw a spear at him at the dinner table. He ordered the priests of Nob massacred because one of them had given David bread during his flight. And when his servants refused to strike down the priests, he found a man named Doeg the Edomite who was willing to do it. 85 priests died because of that day. Men who had given David bread when he was hungry. Killed because a king who had lost himself needed someone to punish, and his own servants refused to raise their hands against the Lord's anointed. Doeg had no such hesitation. He struck down the priests and then went to the city of Nob itself. Men and women and children and infants and cattle, and left nothing alive. This is what fear does to a person given power and left alone with it long enough. It does not destroy the person all at once. It works slowly, converting suspicion into certainty, and certainty into action, and action into atrocity, until the man who was once head and shoulders above everyone around him is giving orders to kill priests because he cannot reach the young man who made women sing a song he did not like. David is in the wilderness by this point, running, hiding in caves, building something from nothing with men who have nothing. And Saul is in the palace, hunting him, unable to stop. There will come a moment, soon, when David will have Saul completely at his mercy, when the man who has been trying to kill him for years will be vulnerable and defenseless and within reach. What David does in that moment will tell us more about who he is than anything he did in the valley of Elah. But before we get to the caves and the choice David makes there, we need to talk about the person who stood in the middle of all of this and chose, every single time he was forced to choose, the harder and more costly thing. We need to talk about Jonathan. Chapter 4. Jonathan. Love before the throne. Jonathan should have been king. That is the fact that sits underneath every moment of this story and never gets said plainly enough. Jonathan was the crown prince of Israel. He was Saul's firstborn son. He was a proven military commander who had done something almost as audacious as what David did in the valley of Elah. He had once walked into a Philistine garrison with only his armor-bearer beside him and said something that deserves to be read slowly. "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. It may be that the Lord will work for us." Not certainty, not a vision or a prophecy or a guarantee, just the willingness to step into the dangerous space between what is known and what is possible, with nothing but the conviction that the outcome belongs to God and not to the size of the odds. Jonathan was not a lesser version of his father. He was not simply the man who happened to be born into the right family. He was brave and clear-eyed and loved by the people around him, and capable of exactly the kind of faith that the stetosi of Israel had always required of its leaders. He was born to be king. And then David walked into his father's court with Goliath's head in his hand. What happens next in the text is one of the most quietly extraordinary sentences in the entire narrative. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, not impressed by him, not attached to him, knit to him. The word carries the sense of something woven together at the level where separation becomes damage. Two things that were separate becoming one thing in a way that cannot be undone without tearing. Jonathan takes off his robe and gives it to David. He gives him his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt. These are not small gestures. In the ancient world, a warrior's weapons are his identity, his capacity, his standing. Jonathan is not simply giving David gifts. He is transferring something of himself. He is saying, without words, that what is his belongs to this other person in a way that supersedes the ordinary logic of possession. And remember who Jonathan is when he does this. He is the heir, the one who stands to inherit everything his father built, the one whose future is already written in the structure of the kingdom. He is giving his weapons to the person who, as his father has already begun to suspect, may one day sit in the seat that should have been Jonathan's. This is not a small thing to overlook. There is a question that serious readers of this story have always asked about Jonathan and David, about the nature of what was between them. And it is not a question that needs to be resolved here one way or another. What cannot be questioned is this: Jonathan loved David in a way that cost him everything that should have mattered most to him. His inheritance, his position, his relationship with his father, eventually his life, and he never stopped. The years that followed were years of increasing tension in Saul's court. David was there, and then gone, and then brought back. Saul was reasonable and then seized by the darkness and then reasonable again. The whole household lived in the particular unpredictability of a man whose fear had begun to overrule his judgment in ways that no one could fully predict or prepare for. Jonathan stood in the middle of it. He spoke to his father on David's behalf. He told Saul plainly, "Do not sin against your servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. He has taken his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause?" Saul listened. For a time, he swore that David would not be put to death. Then the darkness came back. Then the spear came out again. David fled to Samuel. Saul sent messengers after him. Then more messengers. Then went himself. And each time, something happened that Saul could not control or explain. And David was still alive. There came a night when David and Jonathan met in a field outside the city. They needed to know the truth about Saul's intentions. Jonathan still believed, or wanted to believe, that his father could be reasoned with. David knew differently by now. He had been living in the reality of Saul's pursuit long enough to understand that this was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with the right conversation. They devised a plan, a signal with arrows, a way for Jonathan to communicate what he learned from Saul without putting David at further risk. And in the making of that plan, Jonathan said something that showed he understood exactly what was coming, even if he could not fully bring himself to say it plainly. He asked David to show kindness to his house when the Lord cut off the enemies of David from the face of the earth. When the Lord cut off the enemies of David, Jonathan was not speaking about abstract future events. He was speaking about his own father. He was acknowledging, in the language available to him, that he knew which way this was going, that he knew David would be king, that he knew what that meant for the house of Saul, and he was asking David to remember his children. The next day, Jonathan went to dinner with his father and tried one more time. He spoke for David, and Saul's response was to throw a spear at his own son. Jonathan went out to the field where David was hiding. He shot the arrows. The signal was the one that meant danger, the one that meant David had to run and not come back. And then Jonathan sent the boy who had retrieved the arrows back to the city. And the two of them were alone in the field. The text says David fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept with one another. David weeping the most. David weeping the most, not Jonathan, who was losing his closest friend. Not Jonathan, who was staying behind in a household that had just tried to kill him. David, who was the one leaving, who had somewhere to go, who had a future written in oil on his forehead, even if he could not see the shape of it yet. David weeping the most. There is something in that detail that the story does not explain and does not need to. Some losses do not announce themselves as losses until the moment of separation makes them undeniable. Some people do not know what they have until they are standing in a field watching it walk away. Jonathan said, "Go in peace, because we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring, forever.'" Then David rose and departed, and Jonathan went back into the city. They would see each other one more time, briefly, in a forest in the wilderness of Ziph. When David was hiding and Saul was hunting and Jonathan came to find him, the text says Jonathan strengthened his hand in God. He said, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. And Saul my father also knows this." Even then, even in that moment of encouraging David, Jonathan was carrying the weight of what it meant to be the son of the man hunting the person he loved most. He was not naive about his father. He was not pretending. He was choosing. One more time. The harder thing. They made a covenant together before the Lord. And Jonathan went home. He went back to his father's household. Back to the court of the man who had thrown a spear at him. Back to the life that was his by birth and that he could not leave simply because everything in it had become painful. And there he stayed until the day the Philistines gathered at Shunem and Saul gathered Israel, and the armies met on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The battle went badly from the beginning. The men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. And the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. Jonathan died on the mountain. The crown prince who should have been king. The man whose soul was knit to David's from the moment they met. The person who had chosen every single time the choice was required. Love over inheritance. Loyalty over safety. The harder thing over the easier one. He died on Gilboa. And David, who was far away when it happened, who heard the news from a messenger who came with his clothes torn and dirt on his head, took hold of his clothes and tore them. He wrote a song for Jonathan and Saul. It is one of the oldest and most beautiful pieces of poetry in the Hebrew tradition, and there is one line in it that has outlasted everything, that readers have returned to for 3,000 years, because it reaches towards something that ordinary language cannot quite hold. "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. Extraordinary love, the love of a person who gave up what he was born to have because something he found was worth more to him than what he was promised. Jonathan never became king. He never sat on the throne that was his by birthright. He never got to find out what kind of ruler he would have been. Whether the clarity that let him walk into a Philistine garrison with one companion and trust the outcome to God would have translated into the kind of leadership his people needed. He gave all of that up, and the person he gave it up for would go on to become the most celebrated king in the history of Israel, would build a kingdom and write songs and commit terrible acts and love badly and grieve publicly and never fully escape the consequences of the choices he made. Jonathan got none of it. He got one afternoon in a forest in the wilderness of Ziph, when he found his friend hiding from his own father and told him not to be afraid, and strengthened his hand in God. That was the last time. The love before the throne is always the clearest kind. It is the love that has not yet been complicated by power, that has not yet had to survive the specific tests that power applies to every relationship it touches. Jonathan loved David before the crown meant anything, before the kingdom was a real possibility, before the weight of what David would become had settled onto everything around him. That love was real in a way that very few loves in David's life would ever be again, and David knew it. The weeping in the field said so. Chapter 5. Michal. The price of the crown. The Bible says Michal loved David. Read that again, because it is rarer than it sounds. In the ancient world, in a text that spans centuries and covers thousands of human interactions, the explicit statement that a woman loves a man is not common. The text records what men feel about women with some regularity. It records arrangements and transactions and the practical business of marriage in a world where marriage was primarily a political and economic institution, but the specific declaration that a woman loved a man, stated plainly and without qualification, appears very rarely. Michal loved David. The text says it simply, and that simplicity is important, because everything that happens to Michal afterward needs to be read against that beginning. She did not start as a political figure. She did not start as a daughter being used by her father to set a trap. She started as a person who loved someone. She was the younger daughter of Saul. She grew up in the court of a king who was becoming increasingly unstable, in the household of a man whose fear was slowly consuming everything around it. She watched her father's deterioration from the inside, which is a particular kind of education in the fragility of power and the cost of proximity to it. And she loved David. When Saul learned about Michal's feelings, the text says he was pleased. But the pleasure of Saul at this point in the story is never a simple thing. He was pleased because he saw an opportunity. He thought, I will give her to him, so that she may be a snare for him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. He set the bride price at 100 Philistine foreskins. The calculation was military. The mission was dangerous enough that Saul believed David would not survive it. Michal's love was the bait in a trap designed to kill the man she loved. And Saul arranged the whole thing without once considering what it meant to use his daughter that way. David came back with 200, so Michal became David's wife. And then Saul's fear redoubled, and the spear came out again, and David was in danger. And there came a night when Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch it and kill him in the morning. Michal found out. She told David, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. She let him down through a window. She helped him escape into the night while soldiers were waiting to take him in the morning. And then she took a household idol and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with clothes. When Saul's messengers came, she told them David was sick. When Saul found out the truth, he confronted her. Why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go? And Michal said, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? She lied to protect herself. She attributed to David words he may not have said. She stood between her father and her husband and made the only choice available to her, which was not a free choice at all, but the choice of someone with no good options trying to survive in the gap between two powerful and dangerous men. David escaped, and Michal stayed. She stayed in the house of her father, the man she had just deceived, the man who had used her love as a trap and whose soldiers she had just turned away from the window. She stayed because there was nowhere for her to go. David was running. She was the king's daughter. The options available to a woman in her position in that world were not options we would recognize as options today. She waited. She did not know how long she would wait. She did not know what would come back to her, or when, or in what form. She waited with the particular patience of someone who has already made the most costly choice available to them and must now live in the consequences of it, without any certainty about what those consequences will eventually look like. While she waited, Saul gave her to another man. His name was Paltiel, the son of Laish, from a place called Galim. The text does not record Michal's response to this. It does not tell us what she said or what she felt, or whether she was consulted in any meaningful way about the transfer of her life from one man's household to another's. It simply records that it happened. Saul gave her to Paltiel. And Paltiel, the text will later reveal in a detail so small that it is easy to read past, loved her. We do not know how many years passed. We know they were years. David was in the wilderness, then in Philistine territory, then in Hebron. where he was anointed king over the tribe of Judah, while the rest of Israel followed a different path. The kingdom was divided and contested, and the world that Saul had held together was fragmenting in the way that kingdoms fragment, when the man at the center loses his hold. Paltiel and Michal built something. A life. A household. The ordinary accumulation of shared days that eventually becomes something that feels like permanence. Or at least like the closest thing to permanence available. Then David became strong enough to reunite the kingdom, and he sent a demand to Abner, who was leading the northern tribes. The demand was specific. Bring me my wife Michal, for whom I paid the bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins. The language is worth noticing. Not I miss her. Not I love her and want her back. The language of the demand is the language of property and transaction. He paid for her. He wants her returned. The relationship is framed in the terms of what was exchanged, not in the terms of what was felt. Abner went to Paltiel and took Michal, and Paltiel went after her, weeping as he walked, all the way to a place called Bahurim. He walked behind the horses, carrying his wife away from him, weeping, until Abner finally turned and told him to go back home. And he went back. Paltiel went back because he had no choice, because the forces that had removed Michal from his life were forces that a man with no political standing had no power to resist. He went back to a house that had her in it and now did not. And he wept the whole way to the boundary of what he was permitted to cross. Michal was brought to David in Hebron. We are not told what that reunion looked like. We are not told what they said to each other, or whether there was anything in David's face when he saw her that resembled what had once existed between them. We are not told whether Michal wept, or was numb, or felt something she did not have words for in the language available to her. We are only told that she came to David, and we are told, in the cold language of political necessity, that the transfer of Michal from Paltiel to David was part of the arrangement by which Abner would bring the northern tribes to David's side. She was not brought back because David missed her. She was brought back because she was the daughter of Saul, and her presence in David's household was a statement about continuity and legitimacy that the northern tribes needed to see. She was a political object, again, as she had been when her father set the bride price to send David to his death, as she had been when her father gave her to Paltiel without asking her. She moved through the decisions of powerful men like a piece on a board. And the fact that she had once loved one of those men, that she had let him out a window in the night and lied to her father to protect him, did not give her any more control over the direction of her own life. She came to David in Hebron, and then David moved to Jerusalem. And the years continued, and the distance between who they had been to each other and who they were now grew in the way that distances grow between people when they have both been through things the other was not present for. And one day David brought the ark of God into Jerusalem, and the whole city came out. And there was music and dancing and the kind of joy that fills streets and spills over into everything. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of a window. We have seen that window before. We began there. But now we know what is behind it. Now we know the years that preceded that moment, the love that started it, and the father who weaponized it, and the night she helped a man escape, and the years of waiting, and the man who walked behind weeping until he was told to stop. Now when the text says she looked out the window and despised David in her heart, we do not have to read that as simple arrogance or cold pride, or the resentment of a woman who did not understand what worship looked like. We can read it as the expression of a person who has been used by powerful men her entire life, who is now watching the most powerful man she has ever known perform his devotion in the middle of a crowd while she stands behind glass and thinks about everything that performance has cost the people around him, including her. Later, when David comes home, she meets him, and the words that come out of her mouth are sharp and controlled in the way that words become when they have been waiting behind something for a very long time. How the King of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants. as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. David's response is immediate and does not soften. "It was before the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." He went directly to the wound. He named the choosing, his choosing and Saul's rejection. And he framed Michal's contempt not as the response of a complicated person with a complicated history, but as the pride of a daughter who resented what happened to her father's house. He is not entirely wrong, but he is not entirely right either. And the text closes Michal's story in one sentence that has been read for thousands of years as judgment and deserves to be read as something more ambiguous. "And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death." No child to the day of her death. The text does not explain why. It does not say whether this was a divine judgment, or David's choice, or the biological reality of a marriage that had become something other than a marriage. It simply records it as a fact and moves on. But Michal had no child. The woman who once risked her life for love, who was traded and transferred and used as a political instrument by every powerful man who ever had authority over her, who stood at a window and watched a king she once loved dance in the street, died without a child. The story does not ask us to weep for her or to condemn the people who shaped her fate. It just tells us what happened, with the same plainness with which it told us at the beginning that she loved David. She loved him. And then the story did to her what it always did to the people who loved David. It moved on. Chapter 6, The Wilderness School. David ran with nothing. Not nothing in the dramatic sense of a man who has dramatically abandoned his former life. Nothing in the practical sense. No army. No supplies. No plan beyond the next hiding place. He left the court of Saul with the clothes on his back, and the knowledge that the most powerful man in Israel had decided he needed to die. He went first to a priest named Ahimelech at a place called Nob. Ahimelech was afraid when he saw David coming alone. Priests did not expect the king's son-in-law to arrive unannounced, without soldiers or servants or any of the apparatus that usually traveled with a man of his standing. David told him a lie. He said he was on a secret mission for the king, that his men were meeting him elsewhere, that the whole thing was confidential. He asked for bread and for a weapon. Ahimelech gave him the consecrated bread from the temple. And for a weapon, he had only one thing available: the sword of Goliath, which had been kept there, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." He took Goliath's sword and disappeared into the wilderness. There was a man watching that exchange. His name was Doeg, an Edomite who served Saul. He was there that day for his own reasons, detained before the Lord. And he saw everything. He would remember it. The memory would cost the entire priestly community of Nob everything they had. But David did not know that yet. He was already gone. He went to the cave of Adullam, and when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. Read that list again. The distressed, the indebted, the bitter in soul. This is David's first army. Not trained soldiers, not men of standing, the people who had fallen through the cracks of Saul's kingdom, the people for whom the current arrangement was not working, the people with nothing to lose and nowhere else to go. They found David in a cave, and he became their leader, which means he became responsible for 400 people who had no resources and no clear future, and every reason to be difficult. This was not the life that had been promised in Bethlehem. The anointing was supposed to mean something. The oil on his head was supposed to be the beginning of something. And here he was, in a cave with 400 desperate men and a sword he had borrowed from a dead giant. He would spend years in this wilderness, moving from cave to stronghold to desert to forest, always one step ahead of Saul's pursuit, always building something from nothing, always leading people who had chosen him, not because of his credentials, but because he was there, and he was capable, and something in him made them believe that following him was better than the alternative. In those years, he wrote, this is the part of David's wilderness experience that gets overlooked in favor of the dramatic escapes and the tactical maneuvering. David was a poot, and the wilderness made him into something more than that. It made him into a man who could sit with his own fear and grief and put language around them with a precision that no one before him had quite managed. The Psalms attributed to those years carry a specific texture. They are not the theology of someone sitting in comfort working out their thoughts about God in the abstract. They are the theology of a man hiding in a cave while an army looks for him. A man who is genuinely afraid and genuinely uncertain about how this ends. A man who has enough honesty to say exactly what he is feeling and enough faith to address those feelings directly to the God he is not sure he fully understands. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? That is not a question asked by someone performing piety. That is a question asked by someone who has been waiting long enough that waiting has become its own kind of suffering. And yet the Psalms from those years rarely end where they begin. They move. They carry the person who is praying through the fear and out the other side. Not into certainty, but into something that functions like trust. Not because the circumstances have changed, but because the act of bringing the fear directly to God has done something to the fear itself. David was learning something in the wilderness that no palace education could have taught him. He was learning what he was made of when everything external was stripped away. He was learning the difference between faith that costs nothing and faith that requires you to keep moving towards something you cannot yet see. He was also learning something about power. There came a day in those years when a wealthy man named Nabal refused to help David's men. David had protected Nabal's shepherds in the wilderness without being asked. And when he sent men to ask for provisions in return, Nabal dismissed them with contempt. Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? Servants who break away from their masters are everywhere these days. David's response was immediate and disproportionate. He strapped on his sword. He told 400 of his men to do the same. He was going to kill every male in Nabal's household by morning. He was going to massacre a household because a wealthy man was rude to his messengers. This is the David the story refuses to protect. The man who was genuine in his grief and his poetry and his faith could also be this man. The man whose anger moved faster than his judgment. The man who was capable of ordering a massacre over an insult. But before he reached Nabal's property, someone found him on the road. Her name was Abigail. She was Nabal's wife. A servant had gone to her after the dismissal of David's men and told her what her husband had done. And she understood immediately what was coming. She did not wait to be told what to do. She loaded donkeys with bread and wine and sheep and grain and raisins and figs and rode out to meet the army heading toward her home. When she saw David, she got off the donkey and fell before him with her face to the ground. She said, "On me alone. My lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant." And then she did something that very few people in David's life ever did. She told him the truth about what he was about to do. She told him that her husband was a fool and that his name Nabal meant fool and that this was simply his nature. She told David that he did not need to avenge himself with his own hand. She told him that when the Lord had done to David all the good he had promised and had appointed him prince over Israel, it would be a cause of grief and a stumbling block of heart that he had shed blood without cause and worked salvation with his own hand. She was not simply asking him to spare her household. She was asking him to think about who he was going to be. She was asking him to consider the man he would look back on from the throne, the decisions he would have to live with, the blood he would or would not have on his hands when the kingdom finally came. She was speaking to his future self on behalf of his present self's better instincts. David stopped. He said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand." He turned around. Abigail represents something that will become increasingly rare in David's life as his power increases. She represents the person who could stop him. Before the throne, people could still reach him. His own conscience stopped him in the cave when he had Saul in reach. The discipline of the wilderness. The long practice of trusting God with outcomes he could not control. All of that was still operating in him with enough force to override his worst impulses. The question that hangs over the second half of his life is simple. After the throne, when he is the most powerful man in the region, when the word of the king is the final word, and there is no Abigail on the road to stop him, what happens then? There are 2 times in the wilderness years when Saul comes so close that David could end the whole pursuit simply by reaching out his hand. The first time, Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself, not knowing that David and his men are sitting in the back of that same cave in the darkness. David's men whisper, "This is the day the Lord has put your enemy into your hand. Do whatever seems good to you." David crept forward in the dark. He cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and then the text records something that reveals more about David in a single sentence than most chapters do about their subjects. Afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. His heart struck him. Not a divine intervention, not a voice from heaven. His own conscience, operating on its own, convicting him for something as small as cutting the edge of a garment from a man who was actively trying to kill him. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him." Seeing he is the Lord's anointed, he would not kill Saul. He would not let his men kill Saul. He called out to Saul when Saul left the cave and showed him the corner of robe and made clear that he could have done much more and chose not to. Saul wept. He said, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil." Then Saul went home, and then came hunting David again. The second time, David and a companion named Abishai crept into Saul's camp at night. Saul was asleep in the center of the camp, his spear stuck in the ground beside his head. All his men were asleep around him. Abishai whispered, "God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear." "I will not strike him twice," David said. "Do not destroy him. For who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" He took the spear and a jar of water, and they walked away in the night, and no one saw them, and no one woke up. David chose twice not to take by force what had been promised to him. This is the discipline that the wilderness built in him, not the absence of desire. He wanted it. He had been waiting for years, watching Saul descend into fear-driven madness, watching the kingdom held together by the grip of a man whose grip was failing. He could see the throne. He could feel the weight of the anointing that had been on him since Bethlehem. He did not take it. He chose to let the promise arrive in its own time, by means he did not control, through processes he did not manage. He chose to be the man who waited rather than the man who grabbed. That choice cost him years in the wilderness. It cost him comfort and safety, and the life he might have had if he had simply done what his men suggested and taken the opportunity when it arrived. But it meant that when the kingdom finally came to him, it came without the blood of the man he replaced on his hands. It came, in the language his tradition understood, cleanly. The wilderness gave David many things. It gave him 400 desperate men who became a legendary army. It gave him the poetry of the Psalms. It gave him Abigail on a road who stopped him from becoming something he could not come back from. It gave him the long, slow practice of trust, the particular muscle that develops only in the gap between promise and fulfillment, when you have no evidence that the promise will hold except the fact that it has held so far. And it gave him 2 moments in the dark, when he had everything he wanted in his hand and chose to put it down. He would not always choose that way. The wilderness was where David learned to wait on God. The palace was where he would learn how hard that is to keep doing when you no longer have to wait for anything. Chapter 7. Jerusalem. The dance and the distance. Saul died on Mount Gilboa. The battle went the way battles go when the man leading one side has already lost something essential in himself. The Philistines pressed hard against Saul and his sons, and Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua fell on the mountain, and the battle went heavily against Saul. And the archers found him, and he was badly wounded. He said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." His armor-bearer would not do it. He was afraid. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him, the man who had been head and shoulders above everyone in Israel, who had heard a crowd chanting a song and let the fear of it hollow him out from the inside over years and decades, died on his own sword on a mountain while his sons died around him. A messenger came to David with the news. He came with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. He fell to the ground and paid homage, and he told David what had happened on Gilboa. David asked, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" The messenger gave an account that was inconsistent with what the text records about Saul's actual death. Whether the messenger was lying to claim a reward or misremembering in the chaos of a battlefield is a question the text does not resolve. What the text records is David's response. David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. He did not celebrate. This is worth holding. David had spent years running from Saul. He had lived in caves and deserts, and had twice held Saul's life in his hand, and chosen not to take it precisely because he could not bring himself to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. And now the Lord's anointed was dead, and the thing that had been promised since Bethlehem was now within reach. And David mourned. He wrote a song. He called it the Song of the Bow, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It is one of the most beautiful elegies in all of ancient literature, and it mourns both Saul and Jonathan without distinguishing between them in terms of honor. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. He mourned the man who had spent years trying to kill him with the same public grief he brought to the man whose soul was knit to his. Not because Saul and Jonathan were the same to him. They were not. But because both of them had been part of the story that made David who he was. And because David understood, in a way that smaller people do not, that the end of a life deserves grief, even when that life caused you suffering. Then David asked the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go up?" And the Lord said, "To Hebron." So David went up to Hebron with his 2 wives and his men and their households. And the men of Judah came and anointed David king over the house of Judah. He was 30 years old. He had been anointed first by Samuel in Bethlehem as a boy. He had been anointed now in Hebron as a man. Between those 2 anointings were years of wilderness and caves, and 400 desperate men, and Saul's spears and Abigail on the road, and the dark of the cave at En-gedi, and Goliath's sword hanging in a temple, and Jonathan dying on a mountain. He was 30 years old, and he was finally, partially, king, partially, because the northern tribes of Israel had not accepted him. They had gone their own way under a man named Ishbosheth, Saul's remaining son, whom a general named Abner had placed on the throne in Mahanaim, and there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David for a long time. Not a single decisive battle, but the slow, grinding attrition of a kingdom that could not yet agree on who it belonged to. David grew stronger. The house of Saul grew weaker. There were deaths in those years that David did not order, but that cleared his path in ways that complicated the moral clarity of his ascent. Abner was killed by David's general Joab, who had his own reasons that had nothing to do with David's interests, but whose actions served those interests regardless. Ishbosheth was assassinated by 2 of his own men, who brought his head to David expecting a reward. David executed them both. He said, "When one told me, 'Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed? Shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth?" He was not wrong, but he also benefited from what they did. This is the particular moral texture of David's rise to power. The way things happened around him that served his purposes without requiring him to order them directly. Joab was his instrument in many of these moments. The man who did the violent and necessary things that David could not afford to be seen doing. And the relationship between them would run through the rest of David's story like a dark thread through bright fabric. Then all the elders of Israel came to David at Hebron and anointed him king over Israel. The third anointing. Boy in a field. Man in Hebron. King in Hebron with all the elders of a united people. He was 37 years old. It had taken 7 years from his first kingship in Hebron to the moment all of Israel acknowledged what Samuel had declared in a field in Bethlehem decades before. He moved immediately. He went to Jerusalem. Jerusalem at this point in history was called Jebus, and it was held by a people called the Jebusites, who were so confident in their city's defenses that when David came against them, they said, "You will not come in here. Even the blind and the lame will ward you off." David took it anyway. He took the city by finding a water shaft that gave access to the interior and sending men up through it. And Jerusalem fell to David and became his city. He called it the City of David. He built it up from the Millo inward, and the text says David became greater and greater. For the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. He built a palace. He received ambassadors and recognition from surrounding kingdoms. He established military organization and administrative structure. He won battles that expanded the territory under his control. He was doing what kings do, which is consolidate and build and project power and slowly turn a collection of tribes with a shared history into something that functions like a nation. And then he thought about the Ark. The Ark of the Covenant was the most sacred object in Israel's religious imagination. It represented the presence of God among the people. It had a long and complicated history, having been captured by the Philistines, who then discovered that having it in their possession was not the advantage they had anticipated, and returned it, where it had been sitting in a house in Kiriath Jearim for decades, while Israel's political situation was too unstable to do anything about it. David decided to bring it to Jerusalem. He gathered 30,000 chosen men of Israel, and they went to get it. They carried it on a new cart. There was music and celebration. And then, at a place called the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled and the ark tilted, and a man named Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark to steady it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. And he died there beside the ark of God. The celebration stopped. David was angry, and then David was afraid. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" He left the ark in the house of a man named Obed-Edom the Gittite and went back to Jerusalem without it. This moment is important because it shows us something about David that the victories can obscure. He could be surprised by God. He could make assumptions about how the sacred worked and discover those assumptions were wrong. He could reach toward the divine with confidence and find that the divine had its own rules that his confidence did not override. He was afraid. The text says it plainly. The king who had not been afraid of Goliath, who had crept into Saul's camp in the dark and taken his spear, was afraid of a God who struck down a man for touching a tilted box. The ark stayed in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that he had. When David heard that, he went back for it. This time he did it correctly. The priests carried it, as the law required. They had gone 6 steps, and David sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And then he danced. This is the moment we began with. Jerusalem. The streets full of people. Music loud enough to fill the whole city. the ark coming home, and David, the king, dancing before the Lord with all his might, wearing a linen ephod, which is a priestly garment, and not the robe of a king. He had taken off the king's clothing. He was dancing in the clothes of a priest. He was making himself, in this public and visible and unmistakable way, something other than the most powerful man in the region. He was making himself into a worshipper. The crowd saw a king who was not performing kingship. From a window above the street, a woman saw something else. She saw a man she had loved before he had a crown, who had left through a window in the night while soldiers came, who had let her be given to another man and then taken back as part of a political negotiation, who had brought her to Jerusalem and built a palace and filled it with other wives and children that were not hers, who was now dancing in the street while the whole city cheered. She saw all of that in the dance, and the text says she despised him in her heart. When the celebration was over, when the offerings had been made and the people sent home with food, David went to his household to bless them, and Michal came out to meet him. The exchange between them is sharp and controlled in the way that words become when they have been waiting behind something for a very long time. She said how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. David said it was before the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. He went directly to the wound. He named the choosing, his choosing and Saul's rejection, and he framed Michal's contempt not as the response of a complicated person with a complicated history, but as the pride of a daughter who resented what happened to her father's house. He is not entirely wrong, but he is not entirely right either. And the text closes Michal's story in one sentence that has been read for thousands of years as judgment and deserves to be read as something more ambiguous. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. The text does not explain why. It does not say whether this was God's judgment or David's choice or the biological reality of a marriage that had become something other than a marriage. It simply records it as a fact and moves on. The ark was in Jerusalem. The city was built. The king was at the height of what a king in that world could be, and the wounds were already present, not yet visible to the crowd, not yet visible perhaps even to David himself, but present. Chapter 8. The house God promised. David was sitting in his house, not in the field, not in a cave, not on a battlefield or on the road between one crisis and the next. He was sitting in his house, which was a palace of cedar, and the land around him was quiet in the way that lands are quiet when the wars have gone well and the borders are holding, and the enemies who used to press in from every side have been pushed back far enough that a king can sit in his house and think. He had never had this before. The wilderness years did not have this. The years running from Saul did not have this. The 7 years in Hebron before the northern tribes came did not quite have this. But now, in Jerusalem, in the palace that the king of Tyre had built for him with cedar and carpenters and stonemasons, David had something he had not had in any of the years that preceded it. He had stillness, and in the stillness, he thought about something that had been sitting at the edge of his awareness for a while, something that felt, in the quiet of the cedar palace, like an imbalance that needed to be addressed. He called the prophet Nathan. Nathan was the voice David trusted most in those years. Not a general, not a political advisor, a prophet, which meant a person whose function was to carry the word of God into spaces where the word of God needed to be heard, including spaces occupied by kings who had become comfortable enough that they might otherwise stop listening for it. David said to Nathan, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." It is a simple observation, an honest one, David had a permanent structure of beauty and permanence, while the most sacred object his people possessed was still living in what was essentially a portable shelter. The same kind of structure that had housed it during the wilderness wanderings of a people who did not yet have a land to call their own. That imbalance bothered him. He wanted to do something about it. Nathan said, "Go. Do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." It was the wrong answer. Nathan said it sincerely, which is the kind of mistake that sincere people make when they respond from their own sense of what seems right, rather than waiting for a word that is not their own. He heard David's plan, and it seemed good to him, and he endorsed it before he had any business endorsing it. That night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. What followed is one of the most important speeches in the entire narrative of David, and one of the most important speeches in the larger arc of what Israel understood about itself and its future. God said to Nathan, "Go and tell my servant David, 'Thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar?'" The question underneath that question is not hostile. It is clarifying. God is asking David to consider whether the impulse to build a house for God has more to do with what God needs or what David needs. Whether the desire to give God a permanent address is also underneath. The desire of a man who has achieved enough to want to build something that will outlast him. God was not offended by the impulse, but God was redirecting it. Then the speech turned. "Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house." David wanted to build a house for God. God said, "I will build a house for you." The word house is doing double work here. David was thinking about a building, a structure of stone and cedar and gold, a permanent home for the ark and for the rituals of worship that organized the life of his people. God was talking about something else entirely. "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son, a house of people, a house of lineage, a dynasty that would not depend on the goodness of any individual king for its continuation, but on a promise made to the house of David that would outlast the failures and the sins and the complications of every individual who sat on the captive throne. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." Forever. David heard this promise and went in and sat before the Lord. He prayed. The prayer he offered in response to this promise is one of the most genuinely humble prayers in the entire narrative. It is not the prayer of a man performing gratitude. It is the prayer of a man who is genuinely undone by what he has just heard, who is sitting in the presence of something too large for him to respond to with anything except honesty about his own smallness. "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house, that you have brought me thus far? The boy who was left in the field, the one not called inside, asking, 'Who am I that you have brought me to this place?' And as if this were not enough in your eyes, O Lord God, you have spoken also of your servant's house for a great while to come. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, O Lord God, for you know your servant." That sentence is worth sitting inside for a moment. It is not the sentence of a man claiming that God knows him because he is good or because he is worthy. It is the sentence of a man saying, "You know everything. You know what I am. You know what I am capable of. You know what is in me that I have not yet shown anyone, including myself. And you made this promise anyway." Nathan told David everything God had said. David heard it and prayed, and the night moved on, and the promise sat in the air of the cedar palace, and David went to sleep with it. Now we have to say the thing that the rest of the story will demonstrate over and over again in ways that are sometimes painful to watch. The promise was real, and the promise would survive everything that was coming. It would survive what David was about to do on the rooftop. It would survive Bathsheba and Uriah and Nathan's return with a different kind of word than the one he had brought that night. It would survive Tamar and Amnon and the silence that followed. It would survive Absalom and the civil war and David weeping for his dead son. It would survive the old king's final instructions and Solomon's complicated inheritance and all the generations of kings who would follow, some of whom would be faithful and many of whom would not. The promise would keep going, not because the people who carried it were equal to it, not because David proved himself worthy of the covenant God made with him in the cedar palace that night. The promise would keep going because it was anchored in something other than human faithfulness, which is always provisional and always subject to the pressure of the moment. This is the theological spine of everything that follows. Remember it, because what comes next will make it feel impossible. What comes next will make you wonder how the promise could survive the person it was made to. What comes next will force the question that the rest of the story refuses to answer easily. David went to bed that night with the promise of an eternal dynasty in his ears. The spring came, and David stayed home. Chapter 9. The Rooftop. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. That first sentence of the biblical account is not an accusation. It is a notation. It records a fact without editorial comment, which is itself a kind of comment. The time when kings go out to battle. David was a king. He was not at battle. He was in Jerusalem while his army fought the war he had initiated. This is the first thing to notice about what follows. Not the rooftop. Not Bathsheba. The staying behind. David had always fought. In the wilderness years he led from the front. In the consolidation of the kingdom he was present in the battles that mattered. His generals served him, and his soldiers followed him, and the victories belonged to everyone who fought them. But now, in the fullness of his power, in the stability of a kingdom that no longer needed its king to personally lead every campaign, David stayed home. Power does that. It creates distance between the person who holds it and the consequences of the decisions made from it. It puts walls and rooftops between the powerful and the reality that ordinary people live in. It makes certain things invisible that used to be visible, and makes certain things possible that used to be impossible. And the person inside the power does not always notice the change, because the change happens gradually, and each individual step seems reasonable on its own. David stayed home. It was late afternoon when he arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. He saw her. The text does not pause on this moment. It does not editorialize. It records the seeing as a simple event. A man walking on a roof in the late afternoon saw a woman bathing, and she was beautiful. What happens in the space between that seeing and what David does next is something that the story refuses to slow down and examine. Because the story understands that the space was very small. There was not a long period of struggle. There was not a sustained internal battle between conscience and desire. The distance between seeing and acting was short, in a way that tells us something about what years of unchecked power had done to the mechanisms inside David that used to slow him down. He sent someone to inquire about the woman. The information came back: is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? 3 identifications. She had a father with a name. She had a husband with a name. She was not an anonymous woman. She was a specific person connected to specific people, one of whom, Uriah the Hittite, was a name that David would have recognized. Uriah was one of his mighty men, one of the elite warriors who had been with him through the wilderness years, who had fought in the campaigns that built the kingdom, who was at this moment in the field with Joab fighting the war that David was not fighting. David knew who she was. He sent messengers and took her. The language is the language of royal action. Sent. Took. The same language used for the transfer of objects, for the movements of armies, for the administrative decisions of a king managing a kingdom. She came to him, and he lay with her. We do not know what Bathsheba felt. We do not know what she said, or whether she was given the option of saying anything meaningful. We know that the king sent messengers, and she came to the king's house, and he lay with her. We know that when it was over, she returned to her house. This is one of the places where the story requires us to resist the impulse to fill in what is not there. For centuries, readers have filled in the gap with Bathsheba, imagining her as seducer, or as willing participant, or as the agent of her own downfall, importing a narrative that the text itself does not provide in order to make David more sympathetic or the situation more mutual than the power dynamics of the moment allow. The king sent, the king took. That is what the text gives us. She conceived. She sent word to David. The word was 3 letters in Hebrew. I am pregnant. 3 letters that collapsed the distance between what David had done in the private space of his power and the consequences that lived in the world where ordinary people had to account for their actions. 3 letters that arrived in the king's house like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings that would not stop until they had reached everything around them. David sent for Uriah. Uriah came from the battlefield to Jerusalem. David asked him how Joab was, how the people were, how the war was going. These are the questions of a king managing information from the front. They are also, in this context, the questions of a man buying time while he works out how to contain a problem he has created. David told Uriah to go down to his house. He sent a present after him. He was giving Uriah every reason and every comfort and every social signal that a man coming home from war would want. He was arranging a night in which Uriah would naturally sleep with his wife, after which the pregnancy could be attributed to that night, and David's involvement could disappear into the ordinary arithmetic of a soldier returning briefly from campaign. Uriah did not go to his house. He slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. When David was told this, he sent for Uriah and asked, "Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah's answer is one of the most quietly devastating speeches in the entire narrative. Not because it is accusatory, not because it is clever, because it is simply the answer of a man whose integrity is so complete that he does not even understand why the question is being asked. He said, "The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house, to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." He swore by David's life that he would not do the comfortable thing while his comrades were in the field. David, who had stayed home while his army was in the field. He was looking at a man who would not go home, even when given permission and a gift, and every reason to do so. David, who had sent and taken and arranged the whole situation to cover what he had done, was looking at a man whose conscience operated at a level that David's conscience was no longer reaching. Uriah's loyalty exposed David's betrayal without Uriah knowing he was doing it. A simple, sincere answer to a simple question contained, without intention, a mirror that showed David exactly what he had become. David tried again the next day. He invited Uriah to eat and drink with him and made him drunk. And even drunk, Uriah did not go home. He slept on his couch among the servants. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He sent the letter by the hand of Uriah. The man carried his own death warrant. He carried it because the king gave it to him, and he trusted the king, and he was a loyal soldier who did not open the letters of his commander. He carried it from Jerusalem to the battlefield and delivered it to Joab, and then went where Joab told him to go. The letter said, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die." Joab did it. He was a general who understood the relationship between the king's wishes and his own continued position. And he did not ask questions that did not need to be asked. He placed Uriah where the fighting was hardest, and Uriah was struck down and died. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought Bathsheba to his house, and she became his wife, and bore him a son. She became his wife. The pregnancy was managed. The problem was contained. No one who was not already involved knew what had happened. The king had done what needed to be done, and the situation had resolved itself, and life in Jerusalem continued. But the thing that the text says next is one of the most important sentences in the entire story of David. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Not David had made a mistake that could be corrected. Not David had sinned in a way that required a ritual response. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. The full weight of what had happened, the seeing and the sending and the taking and the letter and Uriah carrying it and the battle and the withdrawal and the dying and the marriage, all of it was held in that sentence and assessed. It displeased the Lord. David did not know yet that this assessment had been made. He was in his palace with his new wife and his kingdom intact, and no visible consequence of what he had done disturbing the surface of his life. He had managed it. He had contained it. He had done what powerful men do when the distance between their actions and their consequences is large enough that management seems possible. He did not know that someone was coming, someone who had been to see him before, who had stood in his house and carried the word of God to him, who had told him on that earlier night that the Lord would build him a house. Nathan was coming back, but this time he was not bringing a promise. He was bringing a story about a lamb. Chapter 10, You Are the Man. Nathan came to David. He did not come with an accusation. He did not come with the language of judgment or the posture of a man who has been sent to deliver bad news and knows it. He came the way he always came, as a prophet who had access to the king, as a trusted voice in a court that had learned to listen to him. He came with a story. There were two men in a certain city. Nathan said, one was rich and one was poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing but one small ewe lamb, which he had bought, and he had raised it, and it had grown up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. David was listening. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Nathan stopped. David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold. Because he did this thing, and because he had no pity, fourfold. Death, no pity. David had judged the case with the instincts of a man who understood justice, who had spent years in the wilderness as a protector of the weak, who had formed his earliest identity around the image of a shepherd who defended his flock against lions and bears. The rich man in the story was everything David had defined himself against. He had taken from someone who had almost nothing. He had used his power to satisfy a momentary desire without any consideration for the cost to the person who had least capacity to absorb it. David saw it clearly. He always could see it clearly in other people. Nathan said, You are the man. 4 words. The shortest sentence in the chapter. The most precise sentence in the chapter. Not what you did is like what the rich man did. Not consider how your actions resemble this story. You are the man. The identification is complete and direct and leaves no gap for interpretation or escape. Nathan continued. He delivered what the text calls the word of the Lord, and it did not soften with distance from those 4 opening words. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. This is where the speech becomes something more than accusation. It is also inventory. God was listing what David had been given. the anointing, the deliverance from Saul, the kingdom, the houses and wives of the man who had spent years trying to kill him. All of it given, not earned in the sense of extracted by David's own effort from a reluctant world, but given, placed into his hands by something that was not his own merit or his own strength. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. The charge is specific. Not you have sinned in a general way. You struck down Uriah. You took his wife. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Which means through the mechanism of a war that Uriah was fighting faithfully, while his king arranged his death from a palace in Jerusalem. The specificity is important. It means there is no version of this that David can reframe as a misunderstanding or a mistake of judgment. He knows what he did. Nathan knows what he did. God knows what he did. And now the knowing is in the open, which means the management of the secret is over. Nathan said, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." The consequence announced is not a single event. It is a condition. The sword shall never depart from your house. What David did with a sword against Uriah would become part of the atmosphere of his own household. Not as punishment in the crude sense of divine retribution administered from outside, but in the way that violence introduced into a family system tends to perpetuate itself through the people who grow up inside it. Behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, not from the Philistines, not from the nations David had fought and defeated, from inside, from the people who carried his blood and lived under his roof, and were formed by the particular shape of a household that had a king at its center, who had done what David had done and never fully reckoned with it. David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." The confession is immediate. It is not qualified. It does not come with explanation or context, or the kind of mitigation that powerful people often attach to their admissions when they finally arrive. "I have sinned against the Lord." The sentence is clean and direct. Nathan said, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. But, nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die." The forgiveness and the consequence exist in the same breath. David would not die. The sin was put away in the sense that it would not define the final verdict on his life or sever the relationship between him and the God who had anointed him and promised him a dynasty. But the consequences of what he had done were already in motion in the world, and they would not be recalled simply because he had confessed. This is one of the places where the story is most honest and most uncomfortable. There is a version of the religious imagination that treats forgiveness as a reset. That treats the moment of genuine confession as the moment when the slate is cleared and the story can begin again from a clean starting point. That version is appealing because it resolves the tension between grace and consequence in the most comfortable direction. This story does not offer that version. David confessed. David was forgiven. And Nathan went home. And the child that Bathsheba had borne became sick. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted. He lay on the ground all night. The elders of his house stood beside him to raise him from the ground. But he would not, and he would not eat food with them. For 7 days the child was sick, and on the 7th day the child died. The servants of David were afraid to tell him, because they said, "While the child was yet alive, we spoke to him and he did not listen to us. How then can we say to him, 'The child is dead'? He may do himself some harm." But David saw the servants whispering and he understood. He asked, "Is the child dead?" They said, "He is dead." Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes and went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house and asked for food, and they set food before him and he ate. His servants said, "What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive. But when the child died, you arose and ate food." David said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, "Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." There is a quality to David's response that is neither cold nor resigned. It is the response of a man who has been in genuine conversation with God long enough to understand the difference between prayer that is still possible and grief that has become final. He fasted because the outcome was not yet determined. He ate because the outcome was determined. He comforted Bathsheba, his wife. That detail is easy to read past. In the account of everything that happened, in the weight of the sin and the prophecy and the dying child and the confession, the small human act of comforting Bathsheba is easy to overlook. But it is there. He went to her. He comforted her. She conceived again and bore a son. And he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him. Nathan came to give the child a name, Jedidiah, beloved of the Lord, not despite everything, not after everything is resolved. In the middle of it, before what is coming, beloved. David's confession was real. But confession is not the same as repair, and the story will not let us confuse forgiveness with the disappearance of consequence. The sword that was promised was already moving, and the people who would feel it first were not David's enemies. They were his children. Chapter 11. What forgiveness does not undo. There is a name in this chapter that most people do not remember. Not David, not Absalom, not Amnon, whose actions set everything in motion. The name that most people do not remember is Tamar. She was the daughter of David and a woman named Maacah. She was the full sister of Absalom and the half-sister of Amnon. She lived in the household of the king, which means she lived inside the specific architecture of power and family that David had built around himself. The household of a man with many wives and many children from those wives. A household that was large and complicated and organized around the needs and movements of the king at its center. She was described as beautiful. That detail is not decorative. In the narrative world of this story, beauty in a woman is often the detail that precedes danger. The quality that draws the attention of people with power over her in ways she cannot control or predict or fully defend against. The text records her beauty the same way it records the beauty of Bathsheba, which is the text's way of telling us something about the world she was living in, not about her. Amnon was the firstborn son of David. He was the crown prince, the heir. He was, by the logic of succession and the structure of the kingdom, the most powerful of David's sons, in the sense that the future belonged to him in a way it did not belong to anyone else in that generation. And Amnon wanted Tamar. The text says he loved her. But the word love in this passage is doing work that love should not have to do. What the text describes is not love in any sense that the word is meant to carry. It is obsession. It is appetite. It is the particular fixation of a person who has decided that what he wants is the primary fact of the situation, and that the person he wants is an object defined by his wanting rather than a human being with her own interiority and her own will. He was so tormented. The text says that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. He had a friend, a cousin named Jonadab, who was described as a very crafty man. Jonadab looked at Amnon's obvious distress and asked what was wrong. And when Amnon told him, Jonadab gave him a plan. Pretend to be sick. Ask your father to send Tamar to make food for you. The access would be arranged through the ordinary mechanisms of family care, through the expectation that a daughter would attend to a sick brother, through the trust that operates inside a household that has not yet learned to be suspicious of itself. Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. David came to see him. Amnon said, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." David sent to Tamar, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." David did not know what he was arranging. That is the first thing to say about David's role in what follows. He did not know. He sent his daughter to her brother's house because his son was sick, and his daughter was asked for, and this was the ordinary currency of family care in a large household. But David was also a man who had taken Bathsheba, and arranged Uriah's death, and heard Nathan say, "The sword shall never depart from your house." And now his son was using him as the instrument of access to his daughter. And David, who had once been the man others used as an instrument of access, did not see it. Tamar went to Amnon's house. She made the food. She brought it to him, and he refused to eat. He told the servants to leave. And when everyone was gone, he said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber, that I may eat from your hand." She brought it into the chamber, and he took hold of her and said, "Come, lie with me, my sister." Tamar said, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrage. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." Read that response carefully. She said no. She named what he was about to do. She called it an outrage. She told him what it would cost her and what it would make him. And she offered an alternative. Absurd as the alternative was, not because she wanted to marry her half-brother, but because she was trying to find any language that might reach him, any logic that might stop what was happening. He would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. The reversal is immediate and complete. The appetite that had tormented him, that had made him ill, that had driven him to construct an elaborate plan of access, evaporated in the moment. It was satisfied and was replaced by something colder and uglier. He told her to get up and go. She said no. "My brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." She was right. To send her away now was to complete her destruction. To be brought in and violated and then expelled was to have no claim on anyone. To be a woman marked by what had been done to her with no recourse and no restoration available. But he would not listen to her. He called his servant and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." The servant put her out and bolted the door. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she was wearing and laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. The long robe she tore was the robe of a king's virgin daughter. It was a garment of status and identity, marking who she was in the structure of her family and her society. She tore it. She put ashes on her head. She went away crying aloud. She was not hiding what had been done to her. She was marking it, publicly, with her clothes and her ash and her voice in the street. Her brother Absalom found her. He asked, "Has Amnon your brother been with you?" He knew. He saw what had happened in what she was wearing and what she was carrying on her face. He said, "Now hold your peace. My sister, he is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar lived, a desolate woman, in her brother Absalom's house. A desolate woman, that is the word the text uses. Desolate, not wounded, not recovering, not waiting for justice or restoration. Desolate, the word of a wasteland, the word of a place where nothing grows. She lived in her brother's house. She had been brought in by her father's instruction and expelled from her half-brother's house, and she was now in her full brother's house. And that is where her story in the text effectively ends. The narrative will not return to her. She will not speak again. She will not receive the justice or the restoration, or even the acknowledgement that what was done to her was wrong in the ways that wrong demands to be named. She disappears into the desolation the text assigns her, and the story moves on to the men. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. Angry. That is all the text gives us about David's response. He was angry. He did not punish Amnon. He did not address what had been done to his daughter. He did not remove Amnon from his position, or confront him publicly, or do anything that the authority he held might have allowed him to do on behalf of the daughter who had been destroyed in his own household by his own son. The text gives us one reason, and it is a devastating one. He would not punish his son Amnon, because he loved him. Since he was his firstborn, he loved him, because he was his firstborn. David, who had wept for Saul and Jonathan, who had written songs of mourning for the dead, who had confessed his sin before Nathan with immediate honesty. David looked at what his son had done to his daughter and chose silence because he loved his son. Tamar was also his child. The silence of David in this chapter is one of the most important silences in the entire narrative. Not because it is unusual in the ancient world for a father to protect his son at the expense of his daughter. It was not unusual. It was ordinary. It was the shape of the world Tamar was living in. It is important because of who David was. Because this was the man who had confronted Goliath, who had stood before Saul and before Nathan and before God himself and had not flinched, who had led an army and built a kingdom and prayed psalms of extraordinary honesty about his own fear and need and faith. And in his own house, when his daughter was destroyed, he was very angry and did nothing. The sword shall never depart from your house. It had not been a prophecy about external enemies. It had been a prophecy about what happens when a wound is introduced into a family system and no one treats it. About what violence does when it is not addressed. When it is left to move through the bodies and the lives of people who had no part in creating it. Absalom said nothing to Amnon, neither good nor bad. For Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. He said nothing. For 2 years he said nothing. He sat with it. He carried it. He watched his father be angry and do nothing, and he watched Amnon continue in his life and his position as if nothing had happened. And he watched his sister live in desolation in his house, and he said nothing. 2 years of silence. After 2 years, Absalom had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. And Absalom invited all the king's sons. He asked David to come. David declined but blessed Absalom. Absalom asked that Amnon come. David initially questioned why Amnon specifically, and then agreed and sent Amnon with the other brothers. At the sheep shearing, when Amnon's heart was merry with wine, Absalom commanded his servants strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. His servants struck Amnon and he died. All the king's sons arose and each mounted his mule and fled. The report came to David before they arrived. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. David tore his garments and lay on the earth. All his servants stood by with their clothes torn. Then Jonadab, the same crafty cousin who had given Amnon the plan that destroyed Tamar, spoke up. He said, "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons. For Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar. Just Amnon." Absalom fled to Geshur, to the household of his mother's father, and lived there 3 years. And the soul of David longed to go out to Absalom, because he was comforted about Amnon, since he was dead. Read that sentence slowly. David was comforted about Amnon because Amnon was dead. David had not punished Amnon for what he did to Tamar. David had been angry and silent. And now Amnon was dead, and David was comforted, because the death of Amnon resolved, in the most final way available, the anger that David had never acted on. But Absalom was in Geshur, and David missed him. And the complicated knot of a father who had failed his daughter and failed to punish his son and now lost both of them in different ways. That knot was sitting in the palace in Jerusalem, gathering weight with every year that passed. Tamar was in her brother's house. Absalom was in Geshur. Amnon was dead, and David was in Jerusalem, comforted about Amnon and longing for Absalom, and the text gives us no record of what he thought about Tamar. That absence is its own kind of answer. The sword had entered the house. not from outside. From inside. From the silence of a powerful man who loved his son more than he protected his daughter. From the violence of an heir who believed that being the firstborn son of the king entitled him to take what he wanted. From the hatred of a brother who waited 2 years in silence, because silence was the only response available to him in a household where the king would not act. From all of that, and it was only beginning. Chapter 12. Absalom. The wound that became a war. Absalom was the most beautiful man in all Israel. The text says it without qualification. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. And when he cut his hair, which he did once a year, because it grew so heavy that he had to cut it, the hair weighed 200 shekels by the king's weight. This is the person we are dealing with. Not a shadowy rebel operating from the margins of the story. A man of extraordinary physical presence. The kind of person who draws attention simply by entering a space, whose appearance was the first thing anyone noticed and the last thing they forgot. He was also the son of a king who would not see him. Absalom came back from Geshur after 3 years because Joab engineered his return. Joab sent a wise woman from Tekoa to tell David a story. A story about a woman whose 2 sons had fought and one had killed the other, and now the family wanted to execute the survivor, which would leave her with no heir and no future. David heard the story and made a ruling in the woman's favor. And then she turned the ruling back on him and asked why he had not brought home his own banished son. David understood that Joab was behind it, but he let Absalom come home. Absalom returned to Jerusalem. David said, "Let him dwell in his own house. He shall not see my face." 2 years. Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years and did not see his father's face. He sent for Joab to arrange another audience with the king. Joab would not come. He sent again. Joab would not come. Absalom told his servants to set Joab's field on fire. Joab came. Absalom said to Joab, "Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to still be there. Now therefore let me go into the king's presence. And if there is guilt in me, let him kill me." He was not asking for special treatment. He was asking to be seen. He had come home and been given a house and a city and everything except the one thing that a son in that world needed from his father, which was acknowledgement, which was the king's face turned toward him rather than away. Joab spoke to David, and David summoned Absalom. And Absalom came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed him. 1 kiss. After 5 years. After Geshur and the burning field and the 2 years in Jerusalem without an audience and the elaborate Joab negotiation, 1 kiss. And the text moves on. We are not told what was said. We are not told whether the kiss contained any of the things that 5 years of distance had accumulated between them. We are not told whether David asked about Tamar, or whether Absalom asked about Amnon, or whether either of them said anything that reached the actual wound underneath the reconciliation. The text gives us the kiss and moves forward. And Absalom prepared for himself chariots and horses, and 50 men to run before him. He was building visibility. He was making himself seen in Jerusalem in the way that the king had refused to see him. 50 men running before his chariot was a statement. It was the visual language of power and importance. And the people in the Shalom Jerusalem saw it every time Absalom went out. Then he began to go to the gate. The city gate in the ancient world was where legal cases were heard, where disputes were brought, where ordinary people came looking for judgment and resolution. Absalom went there in the mornings and stood where people going to the king for judgment would pass by. When a man came with a dispute and started toward the king's house, Absalom would call out to him. He would ask where he was from. He would listen to the case, and then he would say, "Your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." He would add, "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute could come to me, and I would give him justice." He was not making a political speech. He was having individual conversations. One person at a time. One dispute at a time. One moment of being seen and heard and taken seriously at a time. and when anyone came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. He kissed them. The king had kissed Absalom once. At the end of 5 years and 2 embassies and a burning field, Absalom kissed strangers at the gate without being asked, without requiring them to earn it, without making them wait. He did this for 4 years, building something that looked, from the outside, like a man who cared about justice, and from the inside, like a man constructing the conditions for a revolution. Patience was the only currency he had left, and he spent it carefully. Then he went to David. He said, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord, in Hebron." Hebron, the city where David had first been anointed king, a plausible destination for a religious pilgrimage. David said, "Go in peace." Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, 'Absalom is king at Hebron.'" 200 men went with him from Jerusalem. They went in their innocence, knowing nothing, and while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for a man named Ahithophel, the Gilonite, who was David's counselor. The conspiracy grew strong. A messenger came to David. "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom." The king, who had faced Goliath without flinching, who had crept into Saul's camp in the dark and taken his spear, who had built the most powerful kingdom in the region, was now fleeing from his own son. He went out on foot, the whole household after him. He left 10 concubines to keep the house, and all the country wept aloud as all the people passed by. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness. David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered, and all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up weeping as they went. Barefoot, covered head, weeping. This is the image of a man in mourning, not in retreat, not in tactical repositioning. In mourning, for something that was not yet dead, but was already lost in the way that certain things are lost before the final moment arrives, when the distance between what was and what is has grown too large to pretend across. Along the way, a man named Shimei came out and cursed David and threw stones at him and his servants and said, "Get out, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man." One of David's military men said, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head." David said, "Let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today." A man was throwing stones at the king and cursing him in public, and David was not stopping it. He was walking barefoot down the road, with stones hitting the dust around him, and he was leaving open the possibility that God had sent this particular humiliation, and that it was not his place to shut it down. This is a David that victory never showed us. In Jerusalem, Absalom arrived with his army and his advisors. Ahithophel, the counselor who had come over to Absalom's side, advised Absalom to act quickly and decisively, to pursue David before he could regroup, to strike while the confusion of the coup was still working in Absalom's favor. Another advisor named Hushai had stayed in Jerusalem as a spy for David. He counseled differently. He told Absalom to gather all Israel to himself first, to make the military action overwhelming, to wait until the moment of maximum advantage. Absalom chose Hushai's counsel. The Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. Word was sent to David. He crossed the Jordan in the night. There was a battle in the forest of Ephraim. David's commanders were Joab and Abishai, and a man named Ittai. David wanted to go into battle with them. They would not let him go. They said, "You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us." Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city." He stayed behind. Before they went out, he gave them a command. He said it in the hearing of all the people. He said, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. Do not kill him if you can help it. Not try to capture rather than kill. Deal gently, for my sake." The language of a father who knew what was happening and could not stop it, and was asking, in the only language available to him as a king sending an army, for something that armies are not designed to give. The battle went the way battles go, when one side is better prepared and the other side chose delay on the advice of a spy. The men of Israel were defeated before the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day. 20,000 men. The forest devoured more people that day than the sword, and Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. A man saw it and told Joab. Joab said, "You saw him. Why did you not strike him there to the ground?" The man said, "Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Protect for me the young man Absalom.'" Joab said, "I will not waste time like this with you." He took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel. They took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. The man who had prepared chariots and horses and 50 runners to go before him, the man who had kissed strangers at the gate and stolen the hearts of Israel, one conversation at a time, the man who had come home from Geshur and waited 2 years to see his father's face, and received a kiss that may or may not have held anything real. He was dead in a pit in the forest with a heap of stones over him, and David was waiting by the gate. Chapter 13. O Absalom, my son. David was sitting between the 2 gates. The watchman had gone up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and saw a man running alone. The watchman told the king. The king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." A second runner appeared behind the first. The watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." David said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Ahimaaz came near and called out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." David asked one question. He did not ask about the battle. He did not ask about the casualties or the territory, or whether the rebellion had been fully suppressed, or what the political situation looked like in the aftermath of Absalom's defeat. He asked one question: "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz said, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." The king said, "Turn aside and stand here." He turned aside and stood. Then the second messenger arrived. His name was the Cushite. He said, "Good news for my lord the king. For the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The same question, the same words, the only thing he wanted to know. The Cushite said, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." The battle was won. The rebellion was over. The king was safe, and the kingdom was intact, and the threat that had sent David barefoot up the Mount of Olives, with stones landing around him, had been ended in a forest in Ephraim. And David knew. The king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, There are moments in literature that resist analysis, not because they are obscure or ambiguous, but because they are so direct, so completely themselves, that anything said about them feels like a reduction of what they actually are. This is one of those moments. "O my son Absalom, my son, my son, would I had died instead of you?" The man who had defeated Goliath with a sling and a stone. The man who had crept into Saul's camp in the dark and taken his spear without waking anyone. The man who had built Jerusalem and brought the ark and received the covenant and constructed the most powerful kingdom the region had known. The man who had written songs of extraordinary beauty about faith and fear and the presence of God in darkness. That man was in a room above a gate saying, "I wish I had died instead of my son." He was not performing. He was not managing the political optics of the moment. He was not calculating how the expression of grief would read to his advisors or his army or the people of Israel who had just fought on his behalf. He was in a room above a gate, and his son was dead in a pit in the forest, with a heap of stones over him, and the only thing David could say was the thing that every parent who has ever stood at the edge of a child's absence has, thought in the place where thought becomes something more primitive and more honest than thought. It should have been me. It was not a theological statement. It was not a reasoned position about the comparative value of lives. It was the cry of a person who could not contain what was inside him, using any of the structures that usually contain such things. And who said the truest thing available, even though the truest thing made no logical sense. "Would I had died instead of you." The victory became a funeral. Joab was told the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, "The king is grieving for his son." And the people stole into the city that day, as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The men who had risked their lives and fought and won were coming home like men who had done something wrong, because the person they had done it for was weeping for the man they had done it against. Victory tasted like betrayal. The army that had saved the kingdom came back in silence, heads down, because the king was crying in a room above a gate for the enemy. Their general had put 3 javelins through. Joab went in to the king. What Joab said to David in that moment is one of the most uncomfortable speeches in the entire narrative. Not because it is wrong, but because it is right. Delivered by a man whose own hands were not clean, whose own relationship to the events of the day was more complicated than his position as loyal general suggested. Joab said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life, and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today, I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased." He was not entirely wrong. He continued, "Now therefore, arise. Go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Then the king arose and took his seat in the gate. He went out. He sat in the gate. He performed the function that kings perform when kingdoms need to be held together, which is to be visible and present, and to give the people around them something to organize themselves around. He did it because Joab was right that the kingdom needed it, and because David understood, at some level beneath the grief, that the grief would have to wait while the function was performed. But the grief was real, and it did not go away when he sat in the gate. Now we have to sit with what this moment actually contains, because it is the emotional climax of the entire story, and it demands more than a description of what happened. David was crying for Absalom. Not only Absalom, the rebel who had stolen the kingdom and forced his father to flee barefoot from Jerusalem. Not only Absalom, the political enemy whose death had just secured David's reign. He was crying for the boy who had gone to Geshur and come back and waited 2 years to see his father's face. He was crying for the man who had stood at the gate and kissed strangers because no one had taught him any other way to be seen. He was crying for the person who had burned Joab's field just to get someone to pay attention. He was crying for the wound he had not treated, Because the thing that destroyed Absalom was not ambition. Ambition was the form the wound took when it had been living in a powerful man's son long enough to need an outlet. The thing that destroyed Absalom was Tamar's silence, and Amnon's impunity, and David's anger that produced no action, and 5 years of distance and one kiss at the end of it that may or may not have held anything real. The thing that destroyed Absalom was a father who could not look at the damage inside his own house and do what looking at it required. David knew this. Not in the clean, articulate way of a man who has worked through his history and can name what happened with precision, but in the way that grief knows things that the thinking mind has not yet caught up to, in the way that the body understands before the words arrive. Would I had died instead of you. He was not just saying, I love you and I wish I could have taken your place. He was saying something underneath that, something his grief was carrying, that his words could only gesture toward. He was saying the path that led to the pit in the forest went through my house, through my silence, through the things I did not do when I had the power and the position to do them, and chose not to. Through the wound I let fester because treating it required me to look at it, and looking at it required me to reckon with myself in ways I was not willing to reckon. He was saying what happened to you did not begin in Hebron or in the forest of Ephraim. It began here, in this house, with me. Would I had died instead of you. The cry of a man who understood, too late, that there are some things a king cannot fix with an army, and some things a father cannot fix with a kingdom, and some things that can only be fixed at the moment when they need to be fixed. In the ordinary, painful human work of seeing the people in front of you and doing what seeing them requires. David had not done that work with Absalom. He had done it with strangers, with the distressed and the indebted and the bitter in soul who came to him in the wilderness and found a leader, with the enemies he defeated and the enemies he spared, with the people of Israel and Judah whose disputes he adjudicated and whose wars he fought and whose God he worshipped with everything he had in the streets of Jerusalem. He had not done it with his son, and his son was dead in a pit in the forest. My son, the words that came out of him in that room above the gate were not the words of a king. They were not the words of a warrior or a prophet or a covenant partner of the living God. They were the words of a person at the absolute bottom of what a person can experience, where all the structures that usually hold a life together have given way, and what remains is just the bare fact of loss. A father who lost his son, not to war, not to illness, not to the ordinary tragedies that claim children and leave parents behind, to the long consequence of choices made and not made, words spoken and not spoken, wounds opened and not closed. The battle was won, and David sat above the gate and said the truest thing he ever said. And it was not about God. It was not about the kingdom. It was not about faith or covenant or the promise made in the cedar palace or the songs he had written in the wilderness or the giants he had defeated or the years of waiting that had formed him into the man who received the crown. It was about a boy, his boy, who had grown into a man in the shape of his father's absence, and who was gone. O Absalom, my son, my son. Chapter 14. The Old King and the Unfinished House. David came back to Jerusalem. He crossed the Jordan. The people came out to meet him. There were negotiations and reconciliations and the ordinary political work of a king reassembling the consensus that a civil war had fractured. Shimei, the man who had thrown stones and cursed David on the road out, came down to meet him on the road back, with 1,000 men of Benjamin, and fell before the king and said, Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. Abishai said, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this? Because he cursed the Lord's anointed. David said, What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? He swore to Shimei that he would not die. He came back to the palace and found the 10 concubines he had left to keep the house. He put them in a house under guard and provided for them, but did not go into them. They lived as if in widowhood to the day of their death. Shut in. Alive. He sat in the gate, and the people came, and the business of the kingdom resumed, and the days began to accumulate again into the ordinary texture of a reign. But something had changed. Not in the kingdom. In the king. The man who came back from beyond the Jordan was not the man who had left. He had gone out barefoot and come back wearing shoes, but the barefoot quality had become part of him in some way that the shoes did not cover. He had wept for Absalom, and then stopped weeping, because kingdoms do not wait for grief to finish. But the weeping had left a mark. He had said, "Would I had died instead of you," and those words had come from a place so deep in him that saying them had changed something about the surface. He was older. Not in years only. In the way that certain experiences age a person past the calendar, past what the accumulation of days should account for. He had been a warrior and a fugitive and a king and a worshipper and a sinner and a father, and now he was all of those things, carrying the weight of all of those things, and the weight showed. The text records, in the opening of the next chapter of his story, a detail that is easy to read past because it is so ordinary, and because what follows it is so dramatic. Now King David was old and advanced in years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. He could not get warm. The man who had run in the heat of the valley of Elah, the man who had survived the caves and the desert and the long wilderness nights, the man whose physical courage had been the first thing anyone noticed about him, who had killed a lion and a bear and a giant and had crept through enemy camps in darkness. That man was lying in his palace, covered with blankets, and could not get warm. His servants brought him a young woman named Abishag the Shunammite to lie with him and keep him warm. The text is careful to say that the king did not know her. She cared for him and attended to him, but the relationship was not what it might have appeared to those looking at it from the outside. He was old. He was cold. He needed someone to sit beside him, child, and give him warmth that his own body could no longer generate. This is the king of Israel. This is the man who had defeated Goliath. And now, the question that had been hovering over the palace since the rebellion and the forest and the room above the gate was becoming urgent in the way that questions about succession always become urgent when the person whose succession is being planned is visibly failing. Who would be king after David? David had not named an heir. This was not an oversight. It was one of the most consequential failures of his reign. This particular failure to plan for what happened after him, to name the person who would carry the kingdom forward and prevent the kind of violent contest that the absence of a clear succession always invites. Absalom was dead. Amnon was dead. The two sons who might have been obvious candidates were gone. One by Absalom's hand and one by Joab's javelins in a forest. Among the surviving sons, the oldest was Adoniah, the son of Haggith, and Adonijah looked at the aging king covered in blankets and made a decision. He exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." He prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. The detail is exact. 50 men to run before him. Absalom had done this. Adonijah was doing what his brother had done, stepping into the visibility that the king's failure to designate a successor had left open, performing the kingliness that had not been officially conferred. His father had never at any time displeased him by asking, "Why have you done thus and so?" That sentence is one of the most devastating assessments of David as a father in the entire narrative. Not that he was cruel, not that he was absent in the physical sense, but that he had never displeased his sons by asking hard questions about their behavior. He had not disciplined. He had not confronted. He had loved in the way that avoids the difficult conversations that love sometimes requires. And Adonijah was the fruit of that particular kind of love. Adonijah made his move while David was in the palace under blankets. He sacrificed sheep and oxen and fattened cattle by the serpent's stone and invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah. He did not invite Solomon, the son of Bathsheba. He did not invite Nathan the prophet. He did not invite Benaiah or the mighty men who were loyal to David. He was not including the people most likely to object. Nathan went to Bathsheba, the prophet and the woman, the same Nathan who had come to David with the story of the lamb, who had said, "You are the man," who had given Solomon the name Jedediah. He came to Bathsheba with information and a plan. He told her what Adonijah had done. He told her that if she did not act, she and Solomon would be counted as offenders when Adonijah became king, which was a gentle way of saying that Bathsheba and her son would not survive the reign of a half-brother who had not included them in his celebration. He told her to go to David and remind him of a vow. Now we have to pause here because this moment requires careful attention. Nathan was asking Bathsheba to go to the king and say, "Did you not, my lord the king, swear to your servant, saying, 'Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne'?" The question of whether David had actually made this specific oath is a question the text does not resolve cleanly. David had loved Solomon. God had named Solomon beloved. Nathan had been involved in that naming. The Davidic covenant pointed toward a continuing dynasty. But whether David had made the specific, explicit oath that Bathsheba was about to claim he had made is not something the narrative confirms before she claims it. Nathan was telling her to go remind David of a promise and present it as definitive enough that David's honor required him to act on it. Bathsheba went to the king in his room. The young woman Abishag was attending to him. Bathsheba bowed and paid homage to the king. And the king said, "What do you want?" She said, "My lord, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, 'Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne.' And now, behold, Adoniah is king, although you, my lord the king, do not know it." Then Nathan arrived and confirmed the report. He framed it as a question to the king, "Have you said, 'Adonijah shall reign after me'? For he has gone down this day and has sacrificed oxen and fattened cattle and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the king's sons, the commanders of the army, and Abiathar the priest. And behold, they are eating and drinking before him, and saying, 'Long live King Adoniah.' But me, even me your servant, and Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon, he has not invited." The coordination between Bathsheba and Nathan was precise. She came first, established the oath, created the emotional urgency. He arrived immediately after, confirmed the political reality, and noted pointedly who had and had not been included. David responded, the old king who could not get warm, the man under blankets attended by a young woman from Shunem. He called Bathsheba back to him and said, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my soul out of every adversity, as I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, 'Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. Even so will I do this day.'" He gave the order. Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah anointed Solomon at the spring of Gihon, and blew the trumpet, and all the people said, "Long live King Solomon." And the people went up after him, playing on pipes and rejoicing with great joy, so that the earth was split by their noise. Adonijah heard it at his feast, and his guests rose and went each his own way. And Adonijah was afraid of Solomon, and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. He was promised his life if he showed himself worthy. The transition was accomplished. Solomon was king, and David was still in the palace, still alive but already in the particular state of the person who has done the final necessary thing and is now waiting for the story to move on without them. He gathered his strength. He called Solomon to him, and what he said to his son in those last hours is preserved in the opening of the Book of Kings, and it is a complicated speech. A human speech. The speech of a man who is trying to give his son what he has learned and what he has not learned, and what he wishes he had done differently, and what he needs his son to finish for him. He said, "I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God." walking in his ways and keeping his statutes and his commandments and his rules and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. Then he said other things. He told Solomon to deal with Joab, who had shed the blood of war in peacetime, who had killed Abner and Amasa, and whose crimes had gone unaddressed for decades because Joab was too useful and too dangerous to confront while David needed him. He told Solomon to deal with Shimei, the man David had sworn would not be killed and then named to his son as someone to be dealt with after David was gone. He had promised Shimei safety while David lived. He was giving Solomon the instruction to address that situation after David died. This is not the death speech of a saint. This is not the final words of a man who has made his peace with everything and is leaving the world lighter than he found it. This is the death speech of a man who has done great things and terrible things and has not fully resolved the terrible things even at the end. Who is passing to his son not only the promise of a dynasty, but the unfinished business of a life that was too complicated to be tidied up before it ended. Be strong and show yourself a man. And also deal with Joab. And also deal with Shimei. Both. In the same speech, from the same man, in the same breath. David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He was buried in Jerusalem. In the city he had taken from the Jebusites and called his own. In the city where he had brought the ark and danced in the streets and built the palace and received the covenant and sat with Nathan and heard the story of the lamb and said, "You are the man," and where his children had destroyed each other, and where he had wept above a gate for a son dead in a pit, in a forest. He was buried there. The days that David reigned over Israel were 40 years. 7 years he reigned in Hebron, and 33 years he reigned in Jerusalem. 40 years. From the field in Bethlehem to the palace in Jerusalem, from the boy not called inside to the old man under blankets who could not get warm, from the shepherd who killed the lion and the bear in private when no one was watching, to the king whose private sins became the atmosphere his children breathed and the shape of the wounds they carried. 40 years. Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. The promise had survived, not because David proved worthy of it at every point, not because the covenant held through the force of David's faithfulness, which was real and genuine and also insufficient. The promise survived because it was anchored in something that David's failures could not reach. In a word, spoken in a cedar palace that had not been conditional on the person who received it, remaining equal to the conditions. The temple that David wanted to build and was told he could not build would be built by Solomon. The house of cedar and gold and permanence that David had dreamed of giving to God would stand on the hill above Jerusalem and become the center of the worship of a people for generations. David would not see it. He had planned it. He had gathered the materials. He had organized the priests and the Levites and the musicians and the gatekeepers. He had done everything that could be done for a project he was not permitted to complete. And then he died, and Solomon built it. The old king in his blankets, the son with his throne firmly established, the temple not yet standing but already planned, the promise still moving. 1,000 years after David was buried in Jerusalem, a blind man was sitting by the road outside Jericho. His name was Bartimaeus. He could not see. He spent his days at the edge of the road, asking passing travelers for what he needed to survive, which is to say, he had no power and no standing and no claim on the attention of anyone who did not choose to give it. He heard a crowd coming. He asked what was happening. Someone told him Jesus of Nazareth is passing by, and Bartimaeus cried out. He did not cry out the name of Jesus. He did not use the title that the religious authorities used, or the title his neighbors used, or any of the ordinary ways that a person in that world would have addressed a traveling teacher from Galilee. He cried out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Son of David." The people around him told him to be quiet. He cried out louder, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." That title. In that moment, From a blind man by the road outside Jericho, the city near the Jordan where the long history of this people had played out in ways too numerous to count. Son of David. Now we have to ask the question that the entire story has been building toward without quite saying it directly. Why that title? Why? Of all the names and titles available in a tradition as rich as the one Bartimaeus was drawing from, did the blind man outside Jericho reach for that one? Why did the crowds who welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem a few days later wave palm branches and shout Hosanna to the Son of David? Why did Matthew, a Jewish man writing for Jewish readers, open his entire account with the words, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the son of Abraham, Son of David"? The choice is not random. The choice is not sentimental. It is the result of 1,000 years of a people living with the specific shape of a specific promise made to a specific man in a cedar palace in Jerusalem, and finding that the promise kept pointing forward past every king who tried to fulfill it and kept coming up short. Solomon built the temple. The kingdom that followed him split, and then struggled, and then fell. The temple was destroyed. The people were carried to Babylon. There was no king on the throne of David, and there was no throne. But the promise had said forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So the people held on to what the prophets had spoken in the years before the fall. Isaiah had said a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Not from the full tree, from the stump. The tree would be cut down, but stumps have root systems, and root systems can produce new growth. Micah had said it would come from Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the hill town where a man named Jesse brought 7 sons to meet Samuel and left the youngest in the field with the sheep. From there, they waited. They came back from exile and rebuilt and waited more. Centuries passed. The promise kept moving forward through every king who failed to fully carry it, through every generation that held it without seeing what it pointed toward. And then a voice cried in the wilderness. And then a child was born in Bethlehem. Now we have to be careful here, because this epilogue is not a sermon. It is not trying to resolve the theological questions that the birth in Bethlehem raised and that serious people have been arguing about for 2,000 years. Those questions are real questions. The arguments about them are real arguments. People who have spent their lives studying them disagree about fundamental things. And the disagreement is not always the result of one side being stupid or faithless or dishonest. But the story of David does not allow us to ignore what the New Testament does with his name. Because what the New Testament does with his name is one of the most sustained and deliberate acts of reading in the history of religious literature. And it is reading that takes the specific shape of David's life with complete seriousness. When Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus through David, he is not simply establishing legal or tribal qualification. He is doing something more complex and more interesting. He is saying the story that began in a field in Bethlehem with a boy not called inside is still moving. It has not resolved into a tidy conclusion. It is still unfolding. And what it is unfolding toward is something that the story of David himself both pointed to and failed to deliver. Because David failed. He failed Bathsheba and Uriah. He failed Tamar. He failed Absalom. He failed Michal in the long years between the window she helped him escape through and the window she watched him from. He failed in the specific ways that powerful people fail when the mechanisms that used to slow them down stop working. And he failed in the specific ways that fathers fail when love is present but courage is not. And the promise survived, not because his failures were small enough to overlook. They were not small. Not because God decided that what David did was acceptable because of everything else he had done. The text is not interested in that kind of accounting. But because the promise was not built on David's faithfulness in the first place. The promise was built on something else. Something that David himself had asked about in the cedar palace on the night he heard it. Who am I, O Lord God? And what is my house? That you have brought me thus far. For you know your servant. He knew that God knew him. He knew that the knowing was complete. That nothing he was or had done or would do was hidden from the one who had made the promise. And he knew that the promise had been made in the full sight of that knowing. The promise was not a reward for David's goodness. It was a gift given to a person who was known completely and loved anyway. And that is perhaps the most unsettling and the most important thing about the story of David that 3,000 years of readers have found impossible to set aside. Not the giant, not the rooftop, not the cave in the dark or the room above the gate or the song for Jonathan or the psalms from the wilderness. Not even the extraordinary intimacy of a man who could say to God with complete honesty, "You know your servant," which is to say, you know everything. You know the worst. And you chose this anyway. All of those things matter. All of them are part of why the story survives. But the most unsettling thing is this. The story does not protect David from the truth about himself. It records what he did to Bathsheba, and what he arranged for Uriah, and what he failed to do for Tamar, and how his silence became the air that Absalom breathed, and what his final instructions to Solomon revealed about the unfinished business he was leaving behind. It records all of it. And then it says, the promise is still standing. Not therefore what David did was acceptable. Not therefore the people he damaged were not really damaged. Not therefore the sword that was promised never really came. Or came but didn't really hurt anyone. Or came and was secretly a blessing. The sword came. The damage was real. Tamar was desolate. Absalom was in a pit. Michal had no child. Uriah never came home. All of that is true. And the promise is still standing, both things at the same time, without one canceling the other, without the grace dissolving the consequence or the consequence negating the grace, just both things, held in the same story, in the same life, in the same cedar palace and the same room above the gate and the same city where a boy who was not called inside grew up to be the king, whose name a blind man outside Jericho used 1,000 years later because it was the name that meant something was still possible even now. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The blind man knew something that the religious authorities who told him to be quiet had perhaps stopped knowing. He knew that the name of David was not a name you used when everything was going well. It was a name you used when you were sitting by the road and could not see, and needed something that was beyond your ability to provide for yourself. It was a name you used when you needed mercy, because that is what the story of David is finally about. Not the giant, not the crown, not the covenant or the psalms or the dancing in the streets, not even the room above the gate. Though the room above the gate is where the story breaks open and shows you its actual heart. It is about a man who needed mercy, who needed it when he was left in the field, who needed it in the caves, who needed it on the rooftop and after the rooftop and in the conversation with Nathan and in the years when the sword was moving through his house, who needed it on the Mount of Olives, barefoot, covered head, walking away from his own city while his son took his throne, who needed it all the way to the end. Under blankets in the palace, still not able to resolve everything cleanly, still handing unfinished business to his son along with the kingdom. And the mercy was there, not because he deserved it. The story is too honest to make that claim, but because the one who made the promise in the cedar palace said, "I know your servant," and knew him, and chose him anyway. And the choosing continued through the stump and the shoot, and the hill town of Bethlehem, and the road outside Jericho, and the man who cried out from beside the road in the voice of everyone who has ever sat in a place where they could not help themselves and needed something larger than themselves, to turn and notice. Jesus stopped. He asked what Bartimaeus wanted. The blind man said, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Son of David, the boy not called inside, the shepherd who killed the giant, the fugitive in the cave, the king who danced, the man who did the thing on the rooftop, the father who wept above the gate, the old man under blankets who could not get warm, the name that a blind man used when he needed mercy. The story does not ask us to remember David easily. It never has. It asks us to remember him truthfully, and in the truth of him, which includes everything. The field and the giant and the rooftop and the gate and the promise that would not stop moving forward regardless. There is something that has refused to stop speaking for 3,000 years. Something that sounds, if you listen closely enough, like the answer to the question Bartimaeus asked from the road. Something that sounds like mercy,